On the other hand, however, their uniqueness, their singularity, is entirely relational, often obsessional. It defines itself precisely by relating to what it's not, which includes the space of its surroundings and the others that inhabit those surroundings. This is why a certain theatricality is never very far removed from the acts and desires of these characters. They love to act, and in their own way to interact with each other. This is why Trim is called upon to read the sermon that has fallen out of Stevinus's book on fortification. Now, the sermon itself, about which I'll have little to say here given the limits of time, takes as its text a line from Scripture. For we trust we have a good conscience. Stern was also a clergyman, and he actually wrote and published sermons of this kind. It's all about trust and about good conscience, and how the one can relate to the other. Today, as we find ourselves in the midst of the most serious worldwide financial and economic crisis since the Great Depression, a crisis appropriately enough related to the notion and practice of credit, and with it of credibility, the contents of this sermon would be extremely relevant to discuss, although we'll have to put that off for another day. Suffice it to say that the question of trust and good conscience appear as a distinctively Protestant post-Reformation theme in a world increasingly dominated by tendencies of individual self-interest. The world of Tristram Shandy was also the world of developing British capitalism and imperialism, the world of enclosures, for instance, and of wars to establish political dominance over markets through economic control of foreign resources. The world of Tristram Shandy, then, is populated by such extraordinary individuals, but who require precisely a world and others in order to define themselves. The way in which Corporal Trim's reading of the sermon is now introduced in the novel makes this aspect clear. For it begins not with a description of the figure itself, so to speak, but with a description of what Stern, or Tristram, calls his attitude. This is quote 5. Before the corporal begins, I must first give you a description of his attitude. Otherwise, you would be apt to paint Trim as if he were standing in his platoon, ready for action. His attitude was unlike all this as you can conceive. He stood before them with his body swayed and bent forwards, not just so far as to make an angle of 85 degrees and a half upon the plane of the horizon. End quote. How the corporal happened to know just what position and precisely what angle to assume, the narrator continues, is something that he'll discuss later. But his suggestion is that the attitude of the corporal was not the result of any conscious deliberation on his part. In fact, it seems to have been the result of a happy set of circumstances involving, above all, the very wound that he, like his master, Uncle Toby, had received in the Anglo-Dutch wars, and which left him partially lame in his left leg. Quote 6 on your handout. Toby, he stood, his right leg firm under him, sustaining 7/8 of his whole weight. The foot of his left leg, the defect of which was no disadvantage to his attitude, advanced a little, not laterally, not forwards, but in a line betwixt them. His knee bent, but that not violently, but so as to fall within the limits of the line of beauty. And I add the line of science too, for consider, it had 1/8 part of his body to bear up, so that in this case, the position of the leg is determined because the foot could be no further advanced or the knee more bent than what would allow him mechanically to receive an 1/8 part of his whole weight under it and to carry it too. End quote. As has often been noted, the allusion here to the line of beauty prepared the way for Stern's subsequent request to Hogarth, author of the Analysis of Beauty, to which this refers, to illustrate this very scene. But this aesthetic artistic allusion is coupled here with a mechanical and physical one to the line of science too. And science here is associated not simply with the advancement of a certain form of knowledge, but, and this I think is interesting, with the palliation of a bodily defect, not incurred by nature, but imposed by man upon man in war. That is, a defect that is a wound, and a wound that is the evidence of the very real political struggles being waged between nations. Trim's attitude is thus determined by his history, by the wound he suffered, by his mechanical and personal situation, but also by the way he deals with that history, which is emphasized in the final paragraph of the description of this scene, quote 7. So much for Corporal Trim's body and legs. He held the sermon loosely, not carelessly, in his left hand, raised something above his stomach, and detached a little from his breast, his right arm falling negligently by his side, as nature and the laws of gravity ordered it, but with the palm of it open and turned toward his audience, ready to aid the sentiment in case it stood in need. End quote. The corporal's attitude thus consists in holding the sermon loosely but not carelessly in his left hand, raised something above his stomach, all of which we find again in Hogarth's engraving. But then there's something that Hogarth hides from view, namely the other side, what Sterne calls his right arm falling negligently by his side as nature and the laws of gravity ordered it. Trim's right hand in Hogarth's engraving falls outside the frame of the picture, which means it does not really fall at all, as it does in the novel, since it is cut off by the frame. In the novel, by contrast, what is invisible in the picture becomes highly significant. For in the end, that right arm, that falling negligently by his side, remains with the palm of it open and turned toward his audience, ready to aid the sentiment in case it stood in need. What's missing from Hogarth's wonderful engraving is thus not so much the object as a part of the gesture, the movement of the palm opened toward the audience. This opening complements the somewhat rigid posture of Trim, leaning forward at an 85-degree angle precisely, dictated less by the laws of rhetoric or aesthetics than by his wound and the need to put almost all of his weight on his left leg. The wounded right side, which is partially outside the frame of the picture, is the side that is kept open to the others, to the audience, ready to assist if assistance becomes necessary. In other words, in the response. But there are two elements of Hogarth's engraving that are in turn missing, at least in part, from Sterne's narrative. And with a brief mention of these, I'll conclude. First, and surely foremost, what is most striking about Hogarth's drawing is the contrast between the bright, if contorted, human figures and the space they inhabit. The figures consist of Dr. Slop in the foreground, sleeping hunched over. Walter and Uncle Toby. Dr. Slop, Walter had wanted Dr. Slop, who's Catholic, there, to deliver Tristram. And Dr. Slop was all ready to do this with a cesarean, if necessary, if possible, and with forceps. And Mrs. Shandy was not at all enthusiastic about that idea, and through a term of her marriage contract, was able to impose the sage-femme, the midwife. And so Dr. Slop has nothing to do but to sit and wait and basically fall asleep there. He's had a hard time getting there. He's fallen off his horse into the mud in the meanwhile, and arrives all disheveled and so on and so forth. So you have Dr. Slop sleeping hunched over in the foreground. Walter and Uncle Toby smoking and leaning back on their chairs in the background. And of course Trim leaning forward at the precise angle, taut but not tense, in the middle space.